Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast, episode 53. I am Cullen McFader, joined as always by my co-host, Clark Coffey. How are you doing?
Hey, what's up, buddy? I'm doing
Not
well.
much.
It's a beautiful day. It is like a crisp blue sky out there. We've got, and this is rare for where I live, we've got these beautiful white fluffy clouds kind of floating by.
Finally, our weather seems to be matching up.
Yeah, I'm looking out my office window here, and humble brag, I can see Catalina Island. The ocean looks beautiful.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I don't think I ever saw that when I was down there.
I can't.
It was a little bit too hazy. But
Yeah, I forget when you came down. When did you come down? Was it summer?
It was end of July, early August.
Yeah, we tend to get a little more haze at that time of the year, but it rained last night.
So, there you go, and it kind of cleans it out. Yeah.
So, which is why, I mean, I'll have to tattle on myself here. I had to ask Cullen for an extra hour today because we had not a huge storm, but we had a storm come by, and it rained so hard and it was so windy that it woke me up, and then I couldn't go back to sleep for hours. But it was, so now the sky is like really clean, and it just is nice. Anyway, I digress. But the point is, I'm happy to be here to discuss. I won't take away
our little indie film that a lot of people might not have heard of, called Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I love being able to use this podcast as a way to share films that people otherwise would never have heard of, and so I'm really excited. I'm really excited to bring this to people's attention. But this is my choice, and I was talking to Cullen earlier. It's like Cullen earlier. It's tough because. On the one hand, I mean, now we've definitely picked films that I think E.T. was the first film we ever picked. So, I mean, if there were ever a mainstream film that everybody and their brother and sister have seen, it's that one.
Yeah.
But I was torn when I picked this film because I was like, well, it's been done to death. I mean, everybody has, there has been more analysis and writing and discussion and debate about this film than almost any film I can think of. I was thinking to myself, well, what in the world can we bring to the table with this? But then I thought, well, a couple of things. I thought, well, is that any reason to not discuss it? Because the fact of the matter is that this film, for me personally, has had a huge impact. It was kind of like the right film at the right time, at the right place. I was like 18. This came out, I think, in the September or something, I think, of 94. So I was literally just starting college. I was a freshman in college. Yeah. And I was like, becoming more and more interested in cinema and film. And so this was kind of like right thing, right time, right place for me. But the other thing was, I didn't want to deny that by not talking about it, just because a lot of people have talked about it. But the other thing I thought was interesting, and I kind of want to keep in the back of our minds as we have this discussion, is that I think this is a unique situation where, you've got me, who was 18 when the film came out, and we've got, you and I have a 20-year difference, or a little more than 20-year difference between us. So I'm really curious to kind of compare and contrast what your experience is like with this film, being so far removed from when it came out. Because I do always think of this film as like very set in a specific time, in my mind, because I always place it in the context of this big movement of independent cinema in America in the early 90s. And so I always think of the beginning of Miramax. I think of, Kevin Smith. I think of Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and Soderbergh. I think of, so much of this. And then I think of like the cottage industry of Tarantino-esque films that this birthed, or this inspired after it.
Yeah.
And so it has such a like it seems so concretely in the 90s for me. It seems to almost typify the 90s to me. So I'm really curious to kind of see through your eyes a little bit and compare and contrast, because, you saw it in 2005 at 7 years of age, but I know you've seen it since then too. So I'm curious, your repeat viewings when you were an adult and, you were kind of able to think, formulate more complex thoughts about it. But so let's talk about that. Let me share my experience with it, and then I want to discuss yours, and then we can kind of use that to talk about some other aspects of the film, if that's cool with you.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that works. Yeah.
so I've already kind of hinted at a lot of this, but yeah, so, it came out in 94. It's hard to overstate for people who weren't around at that time. It's really hard to overstate the hype, the impact that this film had. I mean, it was hugely critically successful. It won the Palme d'Or. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. Now, it only won for screenplay, but it just had such a profound impact. I think it made something like $300+ million off. I don't, what was the budget? I mean, it was maybe 14 million or something like that. 8 million, 9 million, made 214 million off that.
Yeah.
So it was, it's a low budget independent film, which I think gets lost in the mix. I think when you watch it, you see how cheaply it was done, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But it's definitely an independent film. It was a huge success. And I think it's just hard to overstate, not only did it impact pop culture, I mean, it like became pop culture. I mean, it radically,
it was like a zeitgeist.
Yeah, it was like this. It really did.
And in a lot of ways still is. I mean, it really kind of lasted.
Yeah, its longevity is surprising. Usually when you have a film that has that kind of impact and becomes so saturated, and a lot of times they don't hold up. A lot of times they fade away in time. It's like here's a good analogy, like Saturday Night Fever. Speaking of John Travolta, that film had a huge impact. It was a major pop culture phenomenon. It was an extremely successful film. Yeah, people don't really talk about that film the way they talk about Pulp Fiction. I mean, there's a big difference, in how we look at those two films now, but that's just one of many examples. So yeah, I think it's rare in that sense too, that it's actually stood the test of time. But anyway, so for me, being 18 years of age, just going into college, being kind of, my love for cinema kind of growing and maturing, this film had a huge impact on me. I was blown away by it. I hadn't really ever seen anything like it before. I hadn't been exposed to a lot of the films that Tarantino references in this film because I'm like a decade younger than him or so, I think. So a lot of his references come from a time before me. But I did love genre films and exploitation films, and I'd watch spaghetti westerns with my dad. And so I kind of understood, and like Dirty Harry and, some of the film genres that he does kind of explore here, I had been exposed to. But the other part that was, I think, and we can talk about this a little more, and why this film was so kind of impactful and inspirational, especially to people like film students and things, was his story, of course. His story became such a big part of this film's success. And of course, we all know his story now, so I'm not going to recap it in full. But basically, it's Hollywood outsider. Guy comes from kind of nothing. He works in a video store, and he writes his own stuff. He gets to make Reservoir Dogs. It's a huge success, and then Pulp Fiction just blows everybody out of the water, and he changes the game. So for somebody who is a Hollywood outsider who wants to make films, that looks like a pretty, they're like, wow, it can be done. You can do it.
Sweet deal.
Yeah. So that's kind of my orientation to it. What about you? I'm really curious about your experience.
Yeah. I mean, I was, so I was 7 or so when I saw this movie for the first time.
And set the stage first. How did you even come to see it at 7? Yeah.
I grew up in the suburbs. And so, a lot of sleepovers because, all your friends sort of live close by, and it's just you walk over to their house.
I'm just imagining this idyllic Canadian, nobody locks their doors, right?
Stranger Things. So I used to go over to a friend's house, this guy named Evan, who I kind of, you have those friends growing up where it's like they're, his mom was like my second mom, and
sure, yeah,
his whole family knew me. I was at his house all the time, and and same with him, with me. It's like, my best friend growing up.
Okay.
And he had an older brother who always kind of showed us different movies, and we'd go to Blockbuster.
And how old was this
Friday.
Brother? Roughly at this time?
He was 14 about, I would say.
Okay, so not too old. Not that, but compared to you guys.
He might have even been a little bit younger than that, but...
okay.
But yeah, we'd always walk to, there was a Blockbuster pretty close to where we lived, and we'd always walk there and like rent a movie or a game or something on the night of our sleepovers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were there with his brother, and Pulp Fiction was there, and I can't remember if he, as in my friend Evan, had seen it before, like his brother had shown him, but it was either that he had seen it and they wanted me to see it, or his brother was like, "Oh, I got to show you guys this movie. It's
Yeah.
it's like crazy."
But one
And
way or another, it was like somebody there had seen it and they were like, "You got to
Yeah.
check this out."
and so we went home, and again, normally it would be a thing where it's like we would kind of rent a movie that we wanted to see, and his brother would like watch a movie upstairs. But this time, of course, we're all in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably, might have been, I guess it could have been DVD, but it might have been VHS. I can't remember at the time. And so he pops it in, and it starts going, and it was like so different from everything I had seen at the time.
Because what were you watching at the time? Like, what would have been like your, like the palette of your film? What would, like, let's give us an average. Like, what would you have watched with your buddy?
I mean, I liked
Like on a sleepover.
I liked a lot of Hitchcock, but my friends.
So
probably
at 7, you were watching Hitchcock at a
my
sleepover.
dad, because my dad was a big Hitchcock fan.
But
so
that's
I
not
grew
what
up.
you were watching when you went to go stay over at your buddy's
No,
house.
it's probably
was it?
Spielberg, probably like something Jurassic Park or War of the
Blockbusters.
Worlds, or one of his like
Okay.
Minority Report or something like that.
Okay, so like current big blockbuster Spielberg. Okay.
Yeah. And so so this kind of, I just remember watching it and immediately feeling like I could never tell my parents that I watched this movie. Like it seemed so beyond, like, just, I think just mostly not even because, again, and we'll get into this in
Were you shocked? Like, were you, do you have any moments where you were just like mouth agape? Were there any, like, can you remember any of those?
I think it was more just that it was so different that I felt
so
like
not
this,
the violence specifically
no,
or the
no,
language.
Because I'd seen violence before and stuff like that, but
well, sure, you grew up in Canada, like in the suburbs.
Yes, yeah, it's like Mad Max out here. I think it was just the way the movie was, like how they were talking and how it was directed, and
just the whole thing.
There was drugs and things like that.
Oh,
it's like you just get this
overdoses,
this feeling of like I don't even know what any of this stuff means.
Well, you're 7,
and
it would
so
be
you're kind
weird
of like,
if
I
you
remember
did.
just kind of sitting there and watching it, and the Z scene, and you're sitting there.
Oh
like,
God, I
don't
forgot
know,
about.
like you have no idea what's happening, but you're kind of like, okay.
You're like, why is that man in a leather suit? Why are there red balls? Why are there red balls in their mouths?
But I remember I also caught on to kind of the humor of it all, that it was like kind of lighthearted in a way that there's not it doesn't it's not like a self-serious kind of drama. It was also very funny, and anytime something would happen, I just would kind of look over at my friend and his brother and see that they were laughing, and so I was like, okay, it's all right for me to laugh. I can laugh at this because clearly it's meant to be. And then so that was pretty early for me to have seen that movie.
But it stood out to you.
Yeah, and then I don't think I really watched it again until high school. Early high school, I'd say, maybe a late middle school. But
so only a few years later, then, right? Like maybe 4 or 5 years later.
Maybe probably 6 or 7.
And what did you think of it then? You're a little older. You've got more film experience under your belt. Do you have any recollections of this next viewing when you were a little older?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone goes through kind of that, especially these days. That kind of Tarantino phase. There's like, and I teach film, so I know that kids are still going through this, because a lot of the kids that I teach, they get to like grade 9 and they're really, really into Tarantino. And so,
and do you find that this is like equal across gender, or is
it partially?
Predominantly
boys?
If
it is, I think boys, even boys that aren't really into film, were really into Tarantino. I don't mean to generalize, but whereas girls that are really into film would be, but less so girls that aren't into film.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. I mean, in my imagination, I would imagine
it's quite a
boys would be more drawn. But of course, again, it's just a generalization, and not to say that anybody couldn't be drawn, but just I was curious as to whether you had noticed. Is that the case? But so now
everyone kind of gets into.
But
it.
did you do that then? Are you saying that when you saw it a second time?
I wouldn't say that I was as big of a Tarantino fan as my friends were.
But what did you think about it then the second time? Let's go back to
I
that.
liked it. Like, I remember thinking that it was really groundbreaking, and like it kind of picking up on the things why they impacted me the first time. Like sort of helped me contextualize the type of stuff that that I just didn't understand when I was
Yeah.
7. You know, that just even the fact that the film is non-chronological, that like obviously I kind of understood that at 7 years old, but I didn't really get why that was different. I didn't really understand like
Right.
what was groundbreaking about that. Um, and so I really, you know, I would say the style of it too, just that was something that really stuck out to me, that the like heightened dialogue, and that's why again, this was something that you said you hadn't really had a lot of experience for, but weirdly enough, I've seen, you know, both in like publications and conversations about like the style of his dialogue and things like that, and being really heightened. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really find, or sorry, being really realistic, and I
Mm-hmm.
always thought that it was really heightened. I always felt that it was. But I think the thing is that when you're that age, when you're 20 or you're in grade 9, and you see a Tarantino movie for the first time, I think the fact that the dialogue is conversational in a way
Mm-hmm.
kind of tricks a lot of people into thinking that, oh, it's natural,
Mm-hmm.
it's realistic because it's conversational, without
Mm-hmm.
really taking that extra leap to go, well, conversational doesn't really mean real. It just means conversational. Not
Right.
that that's a bad thing. Dialogue doesn't have to be realistic. Um,
Well, I want to hold your
but
thoughts on that. Hold your
yeah,
thoughts on that for just a second. I want to fast forward then, because I want to kind of bracket your experiences here. But
uh-huh.
but this is a good topic. I want to come back to it. Let's jump then to watching it now as an adult 20-something-year-old person. Um, you watched it, I assume, again for this conversation right now that we're
Yeah,
having.
yeah.
Tell me what you thought now. So now, you saw it when you were 7, a totally naive,
Yes, first, yeah, yeah.
non-cinephile person.
Having no
You
idea
see
what
it
it was. Yeah,
again at 10 or so. So you're still, but now let's fast forward. You've watched it now. You have all of the breadth and depth of your film experience behind you. You totally understand the context of this film. But tell me what you think of it now. Not because
yeah.
you don't have the memory of it in its time and place that I do. I'm really curious about what you think of the film
So
now.
I think it was easier this time. I hadn't seen this again since I was in first year university, so
Yeah.
I feel like 5 or so years ago.
Hmm.
It was really easy for me this time to almost just view it as a movie
Hmm.
and kind of try and analyze it as such, as
Yeah.
just like, okay, what's the filmmaking like, and I think that's just because I've been so far removed from like, you know, high school, when it's like everything is about Tarantino,
Mm.
you know, I don't think really watched a Tarantino movie in a few years,
Yeah.
maybe since me and you saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood at the
Oh, that's right.
Cinerama.
Yeah, we did.
um,
That's right. It just coincidentally
yeah,
that movie was released when you were here, and we went to go see that at the Cinerama Dome before
yeah.
COVID hit and it closed.
Yes, yeah, which was
Yeah.
really sad.
Yeah.
But I think that might be the last Tarantino. So I think I've been kind of removed, not intentionally, but just haven't really been like in
In that
uh
space. Yeah.
yeah, and so it was a lot easier for me to just kind of put it on, watch it, and sort of go, okay, like what do I think about this? And I could see,
Like, what did you think? So, what was your you were probably watching it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my guess maybe you're watching it like a little more analytically this time.
yeah.
We're going to have a conversation, but if you can, I mean,
I
what was your emotional response to it
So
now?
I think I mean, my
If you
first
even
thought
had
was
any.
like, I can see why this is the like, you know, every film student's favorite movie.
Yeah.
You know, that it, and I can see why this is taught in so many screenwriting classes and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, and it deservedly so. You know,
Yeah.
it's a very, very unique and good movie by all metrics. But I also think that interestingly enough, I kind of, you know, was able to pick out some of the things that I don't love about it. I find
Ooh, let's start
the
there. I want to
yeah.
start
So I mean,
there.
I think that I was a lot less engaged with the Bruce Willis storyline.
Okay.
I found that to be like, whereas that was the one thing that I kind of always remembered from it. That this
Uh-huh.
time I found that
Because the GIMP
that
thing probably
yeah,
grabbed you. You're
I
like,
think
what
that
is
I think
this?
that this time I was just kind of less interested in that, and found the, you know, Sam Jackson character, and I found
He's so good in
the
that movie.
oh
We're
yeah, he's
just
great,
I mean,
yeah.
he's so great in that.
And the date with Mia Wallace, I thought that was, you know, those are kind of the things that stuck out to me this time as things that I really
Yeah.
really liked, versus the you know, I think that the Bruce Willis story almost leans a little bit into, where Tarantino would go a little bit later, because of course there's like the comedy with the weapons, and he's picking up the baseball bat and the chainsaw and then the samurai sword. And that's not to say that I don't like that storyline in the movie.
No, but it's just your least, your less favorite of the story.
It was just it was. I think it more so was just interesting that this time I watched it and I was sort of like, huh, that part definitely captivated me less.
Yeah.
I think that but I do, it's. I also think that I always misremember what how long. Like I always think that the Bruce Willis storyline ends the movie. Like I for some reason
you forget about that. We come
that
back.
I guess maybe because it's non-chronological, that's technically is the end of the movie.
Yeah.
But or I guess not technically, I guess figuratively, it is the end of the movie. And so I always think that, okay, they do the GIMP thing and then the movie's over. And I always forget that there's like 35 more minutes after that.
And it's a long film. This is a 2.5 hour long film.
Yeah. So I think that was thing. I think that that's something that really works in the movie's favor, is that it's not a movie that, unless you've seen it, 10 times, you don't really remember it on each viewing, like in terms of like the specifics of the plot. And I always kind of like movies like that. Like I like watching a movie where I'm like, oh, I forgot. I completely forgot about this.
That's true. It does. The fact that it's non-chronological, I also think that it's more dense than you kind of think it is. In the sense that, and because I think the dialogue is so enjoyable, and the dialogue is so rich, in its detail, that combined with the out of chronological order storytelling, I think you can go back and watch it repeatedly and kind of enjoy it again and again.
And the perhaps it's and I say this not in a negative sense. I think that this word has a lot of like charged connotation with it, but I just mean that in the most like true sense of the definition, that there's like obviously a gimmicky aspect to it being out of chronological order. It's a bit of a gimmick.
And what I'll just add here. I hear what you're saying. Quentin Tarantino's own words about why it's out of order is this, just out, and you may already be aware, listeners, maybe some of you, but just I'll try to summarize, so Quentin's spoken to this because of course he did this in Reservoir Dogs. He's done this in a lot of, and you'll even see he says like chapter, or something. And the way he kind of categorizes what he's doing here is that he feels like he likes to write, like basically he'd be writing a novel. So it's my understanding of his writing process that he doesn't write in script format, that he actually writes just like you'd write a novel, like in just prose. He's not sitting there in final draft typing stuff out. And so, it sounds like he's a well-read person in addition to having watched a lot of films. It sounds like he's well-read. Maybe a lot of that is Pulp Fiction, but who cares? But I think he's kind of trying to replicate what he would experience in reading a novel. It's a very common storytelling technique to write out of order, of chronological order in a novel. And so he's like, well, why the heck can't you do that in a film? I enjoy this when I read a novel. I like this, so I'm going to do it in my films. But I agree with you. I mean, it does. I don't know if he consciously was like, well, this is going to make my film different, so I'm going to do that. Or I mean, I think it's just that, so gimmick I think is a word that I at least feel like is like, okay, this was premeditated. Like, I'm going to try to find a way to set myself apart. Aha, if I tell the story out of order, it's going to set me apart. I think it's just a way that, like, it emanated from him authentically is what I'm trying to say.
And so what I mean by gimmick, I don't necessarily mean, again, not in a negative way.
I hear you.
Because it's obviously it's a charged word, usually it's used in a negative sense. More so what I meant was that it's one of those things where if this film doesn't, it works really well non-chronologically, and I prefer it non-chronologically. Like I don't think I'd enjoy the movie as much if it was in chronological order. But it's not like a noir movie where you set up some sort of, thrilling beginning with a question and then it ends with a twist on that. It's
this
like
is a good point.
The order of the film doesn't actually necessarily have a payoff story-wise, except for, a little bit of like a, you realize they're in the diner at the end. But even that, it's not necessarily something that's like, oh, it all makes sense now.
Yeah, it's very small.
Diner. It's just, they happen to be at the diner at the end. So it's not, but I like it. Like, I actually think that it bookends the film really nicely. because you're kind of sitting there, you almost forget about the diner sequence when you first watch it, and you're like, well, why did we start on that, and where did that go? And I remember, I think the first time I watched it, I remember actually thinking that, and perhaps this was like the most analytical I got, but I remember thinking, oh, that was just to set up the world. That was just to kind of set up the atmosphere for this world that we're in, that like anything can happen. And that was my takeaway the first time, before obviously seeing it at the end come back.
Yeah.
But I do vividly remember that it like cuts away and you don't go back to that. And I remember just sort of thinking like, oh, it was just like an introduction to, and it does work as that too. It kind of works in that way of really establishing the tone and the rules for this world, that it's like it's a heightened kind of stylized world where anything can happen at any time. Someone can pull out a gun and rob the store that you're in, and it works in that way. So there's a lot of like kind of like multi uses for the fact that it's out of chronological order.
Yeah,
but it's interesting that it's not. Yeah, it's not necessarily driven to that in a sense of like there's plot payoff.
Right, which is an
again,
important
not a
distinction.
bad thing, not a criticism. Yeah,
And because I don't think his films are generally too much about plot. I mean, obviously plot happens, but I don't think his films are focused on that. So I think that's a very interesting point. But I think like I don't know how many people talk about like kind of Quentin Tarantino's world building, but I actually think he does a pretty amazing job of that. And it's fun to see how his films are connected. And they're connected in really fun ways. Characters are related to each other from film to film, and there's just a lot of little touches that kind of connect every single one of his films. And that might be something as simple as production design, the brand of cigarettes, or but like I said, characters being related to each other. But I think within even the film itself, I kind of, there's something very satisfying to me about this kind of full circle kind of that everything that's going on in this little world, it's almost like a snow globe or something, that everything is kind of self-contained, that everything is kind of connected in some way, that all these characters are kind of connected in some way, even if they don't know it yet. I don't know why that's pleasing to me, but it is like pleasing to me, There's an elegance to it, I think, and it feels kind of like an easy elegance here. It doesn't feel like a forced elegance, at least to me. And yeah, it doesn't really have anything to do with plot. It has to do with character, and it has to do with just this like sense that this is a self-contained story. The characters in it are in this little world, and everything they do kind of has an impact.
Yes.
And a consequence to everybody else. And we're going to kind of see that as we go. And we might see that kind of out of order. And so I think there's small little surprises there. They're not huge. They're not plot related, but they're just, kind of small little surprises that I think are really, I don't know. It's very appealing to my kind of sense of what is elegant in a story,
Yeah, no, I mean it's again, as I said, it's one of those things that like I kind of want to go back to what you said about plot not being the center too.
Yeah.
Which is something that I've really found myself, very much believing in for the past little while, and I think that if I can go on a little bit of a tangent about like
do it, go
film school and stuff like that, which neither of us went to film school, but I know that there's a big, you talk to professors and stuff like that, and a lot of people who graduated from film schools that okay, the plot, you have to have like a perfect plot. It's got to be, nailed to the ground, and it's got to be
save the
like,
cat,
everything has to be
3-act
working
structure.
Exactly. And there's all this stuff about like, 3-act structure that you have to read all these rules, and this is what, and you got to know the rules to break them, which is, I guess true to a degree. But I think that I really like a movie that doesn't, I guess the way that I'll put it is that you can have a movie with bad plot or lack thereof, that is directed to a T, that is a really, really like well shot, well, acted, just like in terms of like writing scene to scene, the dialogue, it's great and all that. I would take that over a movie that's poorly directed,
Sure.
but with just like a really brilliant plot.
Yeah.
You know, so, and I think that that's kind of what I like about this movie, is that it's not so concerned with you know it kind of almost feels Altman-esque in a way.
Hmm.
You know, we did The Long Goodbye a while ago, and you know, The Long Goodbye is a movie that like sort of has a very vague plot. It's kind of just like Elliot Good walking around and meeting
Yeah.
people, and not to get off of Tarantino, but I also noticed that was, and these are two filmmakers who are contemporary and are very similar, but Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I noticed that a complaint about Paul Thomas Anderson's newest movie, Licorice Pizza, which I loved. I thought it was fantastic.
Don't tell me anything about it because
I
I've
won't
not
tell you
actually
anything,
seen
but
it, so
it's
no
not,
spoilers.
It's very similar. It's
Yeah.
in that it's not got plot. It's very much about the scene to scene. Almost
Yeah.
like
Well,
every
like Phantom
scene
Thread
is,
was very much this
yeah,
way. Yeah.
and it's like every scene is sort of more of like an anecdote or its own little set piece or tableau that kind of feeds into the larger feel of something, but not necessarily the larger overarching plot.
Right.
You know, if you were to ask somebody what is Pulp Fiction about in a sentence,
Oh.
you couldn't really give an answer like you could with a Star Wars. Like, you know,
Right.
Star Wars is about a band of rebels who steal plans and have to rescue a princess to blow up a deadly weapon, right? But this much more, you would get into the feeling, and I noticed that, you know, someone who's not very similar to Tarantino on a stylistic level, but you get into that with one of my favorite filmmakers, Malick, as well. And I've noticed that I've been drawn towards these filmmakers recently, who Michael Mann as well, who I love, who are more concerned with the moment-to-moment feel of their movies, with the moment-to-moment, you know, I don't want to say it like it's like an everyday life sort of thing, like slice of life, because that's not really quite what I'm trying to describe. But rather this feeling that that conversations don't have to be pertinent to plot. That you can have, and I think that's the thing about this. You know, they spend like 4 minutes talking about cheeseburgers, and it's something that kind of comes back up through the movie as a little bit of sort of like a callback. But it's not like later on, you know, the key to the mystery of like what's in the briefcase is the big
Royale
Kahuna
with
burger
cheese,
that they
ding,
discussed,
ding,
or
ding,
Royale with
ding.
cheese or something. Yeah, and so I find myself drawn to that a lot.
I feel like I hold on, I just have this total crazy thought. I just imagine, so if like Bruckheimer did this or something, I could imagine at the end of the film there'd be a bomb that's about to go off, and they have to like guess the password to turn off the bomb, and they're like, oh my god, what? Royale with cheese, and it like disarms the bomb with like 1 second left. Okay, sorry.
It's not a movie that necessarily. It's a movie that simultaneously deals a lot with setup and payoff, but also plays with that trope. In that it like half of the things that are set up don't have payoff, and it's not in a frustrating way. It's just in a really interesting kind of,
or payoff in a different way, kind of, you know. And there is a lot of, and I guess that's what I'm trying to hint at when I say like I feel like there really is kind of this just intuitive elegance to this, where I feel, first of all, and I think we all, just as an audience member, you don't have to be a super articulate cinephile or critic to kind of feel this, but you watch a movie, and you know, sometimes you'll watch a movie and you just feel like you are in the hands of somebody who really knows what they're doing. And you can settle in, and you trust the filmmaker, you trust the storyteller, and you just go along for the ride. And you're totally able to focus on the story because you feel like you're in such good hands. I would say that is a rarity. Most films that I watch, there's always I'm not fully engaged because there's always a part of me that's like, oh, that was like just a little less than elegant. That was like, I see where the mark they were trying to hit. They got close, but they didn't quite hit it.
It didn't
like
nail
that's
the
not
mark.
that's not a perfectly like elegant solution. They didn't perfectly make that jump or that, you know. So, but in this film, I really don't get a sense of any of that. But I think this is a bit. I think these little setups and payoffs that are kind of spread throughout the film, and they're not huge, right? They don't have to be huge. Often they're just in dialogue, or how the characters are sharing the same space and kind of interact later, or something like that. But it's just very satisfying to me.
Well, it's even with the feature that I made, I watching it now. There's a lot of things that I think I missed. I can point out and say
Yeah.
like, oh,
Well,
I
you're
didn't quite
learning.
hit the mark on that I wanted to.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that with the next one that I'm writing, it's almost like if you worry less about really writing something to hit a very, very specific thing in your head and then try to execute that perfectly. Whereas what I think this sort of does, and what I've learned from that, is that if you write something where you get an idea or a gist of it,
Hmm.
and then on set you work out, okay, this is how we're going to do it, that can be a more effective way of hitting those marks. And I can see that Tarantino's obviously someone who likes to work a lot out on set,
Yeah.
and talk to actors and try things. What's interesting is that, again, a lot of people in my generation and yours too are really, really inspired by Tarantino and take a lot from him. I've found that I've always sort of not necessarily that I'm not inspired by him, but he's never really hit my, like to say, if I've had to rank the top 10 directors that
Yeah.
like have
He's
really
not there for
inspired
you.
what I
Yeah.
do. That's not to say I don't like him. There are plenty of directors that I love that aren't, that
Mhm.
don't necessarily like inspire me stylistically.
Yeah.
But what I will say also with that though is that he's somebody that is really, really helpful, even though I don't necessarily stylistically pull from Tarantino.
Mhm.
That I can look at the way that he makes a movie, and I can go, okay, that's what he's doing here. How can I apply that and kind of turn that into something myself and turn that
Sure.
into my own work? And so I think that's he's a really valuable filmmaker in that way, if that makes sense. Even the movies of his, like, I'm not a really big fan of The Hateful Eight,
Mhm.
but I would still, there's still such a depth of stuff to study about that movie versus something like, the latest Marvel movie or something like that. Like
Right.
there's like you said, someone who really knows what they're doing and deeply cares about cinema is always going to, like, even their, or even with Herzog, the Herzog movies that I maybe don't love, still like it similarly to this, don't necessarily mean that I can't get anything out of them.
Sure.
In fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah. Of course.
And this is not one of those movies that I would say is like that. This is a movie that I think that I really do like.
Yeah.
But it is just sort of interesting that, like, even the directorial choices that he makes here that I don't necessarily agree with on like a stylistic level,
Yeah.
I still am fascinated with them. I'm
Yeah,
still
yeah.
looking at them and going, okay, like, what's he doing here?
Well, I mean, that's the thing is, like, look, you don't ever, and this is, I think this happened, right? This film came out, this combined with Reservoir Dogs, his posters are on every college dorm room I ever, went into.
Yes,
when
still to this day.
Yeah, that's interesting to know because I haven't been in a college dorm room in a really long time. But I certainly know it was like you had Bob Marley and you had Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, and that was like what people had on their wall when I was a kid. But yeah, I mean, and I think that's the trap that people fall into, though. There's nothing wrong with people have been inspired by his work, but then they try to ape the specifics of what make him
Yes.
him, and
Yeah.
and that's just never going to work. You aren't him. Nobody's him. You have to be your own person, and you have to have your own authentic voice. And that the irony is, of course, is that that's what he did. He was steadfastly his own filmmaker, and it just
Yeah.
so happened that there was a market for who he is and what he made, but he didn't change himself to find some market. He didn't, a lot of people argue that he steals a lot, and he does, but he definitely makes it his own.
And
There's
and
no
yeah, and that's
question.
exactly what I mean, is that,
So
like,
you can't, yeah, it's good that you don't want to take all of his pieces of how he makes a film and make a film, or you wouldn't want to do that with any other, whether it's Malick
Yeah.
or Kubrick or
Yeah.
anybody else. You want to
Yeah.
be your own filmmaker.
I think that's what's important is if, I guess, anyone is listening to this and they are starting out or they're a film school student or something like that. Like, I know a lot of people who, when they made short films, when they made movies, they like tried to emulate Tarantino's like writing style.
Well,
Like,
in the
how does he
beginning,
write
that's normal.
dialogue?
I don't think there's anything wrong with that in the beginning.
No, to practice, no. But I think that when you're trying to,
You'll grow out of it.
yeah, and if you're like, if you're trying to make a short film to kind of be like in a way a proof of concept for yourself as a director, write that, sure, write that Tarantino screenplay. Take it and try to emulate his dialogue. But then do another draft where you say, okay, how am I going to, like, what if I pull the Tarantino out of it?
It's a
what
process.
am I left with? Because I think I think at that
finding your
point
own voice is finding your own voice is definitely a process. And I always try to tell, like, and it may change over time. Ideally, it will change as you grow as a person. But I want to, like, I think a lot of people, they look at this is I think another reason why Tarantino is kind of an inspiration. It seems like Tarantino arrived fully formed, right?
Yes, yeah.
Because he popped on the scene with Reservoir Dogs. It was a substantial film, and he wrote True Romance, which was also a successful and substantial film. He wrote Natural Born Killers, which was still successful and did have an impact. It's a controversial film. A lot of people love it. A lot of people hate it, think it's horrible. Of course, the script is radically different as Stone has rewritten it. But nonetheless, Quentin's name's there. But, and then, for his sophomore slump, he didn't have a slump. He had he created a masterpiece. So, but one of the things that I think is interesting is that, before he got to the place where he was selling scripts and before he got to a place where he had Reservoir Dogs, in listening to I think the only commentary track he's done for any of his films, he did a commentary track for True Romance, of course, which he only wrote, but he does a commentary track on that. And he talks about how he wrote at least 30 scripts before he was able to kind of find his voice and complete a full script that he was happy with and wanted to do something with. And he started writing, he says, when he was, something like, ridiculously young. I forget what he says there, but maybe even as far back as 7, he started writing. So it takes time, and it wasn't like he just sat down and wrote a couple scripts and they became Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Sometimes it's easy to forget that. So it's a process. I think if you write 30 scripts at your own at home, you're going to start to find your voice. Even if you start out kind of aping somebody else's, keep writing. You'll find your own voice.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a like very good point to make because, it's not there's not really any such thing as like an overnight success in the way that there is.
Not really, yeah.
Even people who you might say someone who I don't think I've seen any of his movies, but this guy David F. Sandberg, who was like a YouTube short film guy.
I have no idea who that is.
Warner Brothers discovered one of his movies, and he's now directing like big blockbusters.
Oh, wow.
Literally just from being discovered on YouTube, which is really cool. And he seems like a really nice guy. I've just not really seen many of his movies or any of them. But if you go to his YouTube channel, he was making movies for like 20 or 10 years. Like he was making short films for like 10 years before. Yeah. So you might say, he was an overnight success in the way that he made one short film that got big and Warner Brothers wanted to make a feature out of it.
But it was a lot of work before that.
But he had been making movies for how long, know? And I think that's something that's really, really tough to play with. There is something that I always tried to keep myself from thinking was that like, okay, I'm gonna make a feature and then that's it. I just kind of get to sit back and coast on the fact that I made a feature.
Right.
And you kind of have to like through the entire process, whether it is you're making a feature, or you're making a short film, or you're writing a screenplay and whatever, you kind of have to keep thinking like, no, like this is not the final step. I'm never on the final step.
Yeah.
It's just a very long staircase.
It's just a process. Yeah.
So like as soon as I finished my movie, as soon as I wrapped the final cut of it and sent it off to festivals, I didn't just sit back and go, okay, I'm done. I immediately started writing 3 other movies.
Yeah.
And was planning on what I wanted to do next. And I was going, okay, how am I going to market this movie? How am I going to simultaneously while I'm writing my next ones, how do I use this as a jumping off board to make those? And so I think that's the same thing is that like, and the next movie I'm writing is very different, but also still has, I would say a more distilled version of my voice. And I think it's similar with Tarantino, like you said, that just because his first 2 movies were big movies doesn't mean that he hadn't,
and you
gone
can
through
see
years and years of struggling.
If you read his original script for Natural Born Killers, not Stone's version, but if you read it, and you read True Romance script, and if you read these back to back, and then you read Reservoir Dogs, and you read Pulp Fiction, you'll see that he is constantly refining his voice. You'll see that there's these basic narrative threads, these basic character types, even like base kind of fundamental plot devices are the same in piece or in whole throughout all these films. I mean, he keeps going back to the same place over and over, but he's refining.
I think something else that's kind of inspiring about him is that both with writing and direction, he very clearly does not care to fit in.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that also takes a lot of courage. That
Yeah.
a lot of time when you're writing a screenplay or you're directing something, as a beginner, you're kind of thinking, okay, I've got to make something that people want to see, without kind of going, hang on, if I just make something true to myself, then I can just hope that what I am doing is something that people want to
Right.
see.
Well,
And I think that that's something that's really
he's got to
noteworthy
make
about
something.
this.
The language he uses, and other people have used it too, and I tend to agree with this, is that you got to make a film that you want to see.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
I mean, it has to
exactly.
be a film that you want to see, and I know that there's a lot of. I think it's one of the reasons that I enjoy him, and I think that sadly, the market is now filled with films that are kind of focus group created. So that's all the Disney
Well, it's
films.
primarily that. That's that's
And there
yeah.
aren't as many films, I think, that are a kind of a singular vision
No. Yeah.
of someone. They're
They're very much the exception.
especially at this budget. He's making $100 million movies sometimes, like Django Unchained, for example, is like $100 million film. Once Upon a Time, I think, was probably right around $100 million film, I think, or so. So there just aren't that many filmmakers who are able to make a film that's their singular vision from beginning to end. It's his script. He writes it. He doesn't have to modify it to get budget. He shoots it, directs it. It's exactly what he wants, and he's got final cut. And boom, and he, it's like props to Sony with Once Upon a Time. I think China refused to release it. Of course, China is the largest market now.
Yeah.
And Quentin Tarantino was like, no, I'm not changing this so that it can be released in China. I don't remember exactly how that sussed out. I don't know if it would, if it was eventually able to be, but I know that he didn't change his film.
The unfortunate aspect about that is that it's you have to, at this point, and perhaps this is something about just like the state of the film industry today, but you have to be a Tarantino or a Spielberg or
to
any
get a
number
film
of
made.
director that has a not only to get a film made, but to get final cut rights and to get
even those other filmmakers. I think Quentin Tarantino is even more unique than most of these other filmmakers, because even some of these big filmmakers that you talk about, they have trouble getting finance. Like Scorsese, has
that's why he had to
trouble
go to
getting
Netflix for The Irishman.
right.
Yeah.
And there aren't many filmmakers I can think of, and I think even Spielberg doesn't necessarily have an ace in the hole for getting a budget for a film.
And maybe one day we'll do, this might be a neat episode to actually just talk about kind of the state of the film industry today. Maybe we'll do that one day. But
well, I want to touch on something real quick. I want to go back to something because I'm curious about this. And you've mentioned this a couple of times. You said that you feel like Quentin Tarantino is like a quote unquote phase that people go through, and that almost every film student that at least you work with or that you've seen latches on to Tarantino as a director, maybe first or in the beginning, or it's almost
it's
like
kind
this,
of like it's
it's
almost
like a given. It's almost like a given. I'm curious, what do you think that is? Like, why why do you think that he is so popular so immediately with people who are interested in film and maybe want to make film? I'm curious. What's your thoughts on that?
I think I think it's because it's one of those things where these allergies are killing me.
Oh my gosh! I'm gonna leave that in. We are not editing that out.
I think one of the things is that you have these kids who are growing up, elementary school, middle school. It's not really often that a parent is going to be like, we're going to go see the new R-rated Tarantino movie, or we're going to rent the R-rated Tarantino movie. Maybe a little bit more common these days with Netflix, where it's like you don't necessarily have control as to what a kid is watching. But at least back in my day, when it was Blockbuster and stuff like that, and then you didn't have that. And you as well, I'm sure, would agree. The thing is that Tarantino he is a loud, confident, um, unique filmmaker,
Hmm.
and I think that you turn 14, and this is something that I saw happen to all of my friends. Not this is a bad thing by any means. I'm not saying this is like
Yeah.
this is the warning story of catching the Tarantino, but it's just something that I've
Yeah.
noticed happen to all my friends, and I've noticed it happen to like most of the film students I teach.
Hmm.
You turn 14 and you see Pulp Fiction for the first time, or you see Kill Bill, or you see, Inglorious Bastards, and you go, this is so, and I don't mean loud in a bad way. This is so, but it's loud, it's confident,
Hmm.
it wears its heart on its sleeve,
Hmm.
and you go, I can do that. I can do that with things that I love. And so you kind of go, and I remember in high school, there was like when we were in a Comtech class, one of the assignments was to make 3 different movies. And one of my friends was like, well, we have to make a Tarantino movie. It was like, you had to make 3 different movies in 3 different
Yeah.
genres. And it's like, it's almost its own genre, like this idea
Yes.
of
Yeah.
Tarantino, this kind of like, I described it as sort of like almost like a jukebox sense of like all these different genres, or remix might be a better way to describe it, of like
Yeah.
taking all these things that Tarantino loves and putting them into one. And it's honestly, he is one of the easier filmmakers to emulate the style of.
Hmm. Well,
And
superficially, maybe.
superficially, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, it's very, if I when I was in grade 10, I could superficially emulate the style of Tarantino, and most people who have seen a Tarantino film would be like, oh, you're
I
doing
get it. I know what you're
Tarantino.
trying to do. Yeah.
From the title cards,
Yeah.
the music that he uses,
Hmm.
the way that the camera moves, the energy, the performances, the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's really something that's super, super accessible for a lot of like kids around that age, I think, and filmmakers around that age. And so I think that it just winds up being this thing where it's like, well, I don't know quite what I want to write, so I'm gonna write a really badass sword fight, but I'm gonna make it super. Like, I remember when I was applying to go to film school, everyone's making these like very artsy, like black and white. Oh, here's a person sitting on a park bench who sees their old self pass by and writes a
Yeah,
letter,
yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like all that kind of thing to get in. And I made this like crazy like Kill Bill style samurai sword fight, and I got into school. I didn't wind up going, but I like got into all the schools that I submitted that to, and I think it's just something that like it's so boisterous, and it's really it's just very stylistically accessible. Again, I guess that's the word I
Maybe
can say, is that it
well, and it obviously has an impact on people. My
yeah.
experience is a little different, so I don't have a lot of exposure to young film students.
Mhm.
The exposure that I had to film students was, so for example, at like UCLA or AFI, especially AFI. So we're talking about graduate
Mhm.
students, okay? And AFI is a pretty high level of graduate student. And the
Mhm.
reason I had exposure to them is that through SAG, I was on AFI's like list of actors that students could, like I was in an actor pool that students could pull from to make their films, their projects there as they were going through that conservatory. So I even was attended some classes and was involved as an actor in classes where directors would work with us, and then I've been in some AFI films. Okay. And it's funny because it couldn't be the more opposite at that level. So I wonder, I almost have this hypothesis where it's like you're a kid. I'm going to use kid, broadly, but you're young.
Early teenager, yeah.
And this like really jumps out at you. And you're almost like you don't have any fear of trying to like steal from it, right? So, you're like, well, this was awesome. I felt something when I watched this, so I want to emulate that. I want to also
Yeah.
do something that's kinetic and cinematic and vibrant. And like you said, it's at least superficially you can kind of point to the stylistic, what you feel like is making this quote unquote Tarantino-esque.
Quentin Tarantesque.
But what I see, yeah, but what I feel like I saw when these older film students is like these brooding, like, I mean, this like
Very, very deeply
student
personal
film where
and-
it's like, ooh,
yeah.
this is super deep, and I'm gonna like really, this is gonna be an introspective, deep, character-driven meditation on character,
Yeah.
and it'll be
Yeah.
black and white, and I'm just gonna have like you like I love your description of like there's a character sitting on a park bench watching like their older self walk by
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something.
It's all. It's all.
I
It's a
mean,
lot of stuff like
you know,
that. Yeah.
just like this horse pucky, man. And I was involved in numerous scripts that were pretty similar to that, where I was just like, you know, like there's just it's like this such a desire to be deep, and it almost feels like it was like a rebellion against, or like, you know, okay, I can't be kinetic and like, you know, in the way that Quentin does his films. I've got to like rebel. I've got to like move as far as I feel like I can from that, and I'm going to be introspective and, you know, all this kind of stuff that we just described. So I don't know, that's kind of my exposure. I wish that I would have gotten to be in a film where a director at AFI wanted to make a Tarantino-esque film, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that that's you kind of got it right on the. Again, I don't want to say grow out of it sense, because it's like, I don't mean to sound like Tarantino is only an entry level filmmaker, but rather that I think that people, it's because it's so accessible, and because, you know, for example, like if something exciting happens, Tarantino pushes in on it.
Mm.
And so as a new filmmaker, you can go, well, okay, I understand why he's pushing in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I do think that you're right in saying that it's something that people then take, and then you kind of like with everything you make, you chip off that style a little bit more until it's you're at the core of what you want to make. And
Which
of course,
is definitely
sometimes
not
that goes
what I
into,
saw. I definitely didn't see that in these older students.
But sometimes it becomes something where people want to immediately. It's like one of those things where, you know, because it's popular, it can't be good.
Yeah, I
So
feel like that.
people are
Yeah.
really into
Little of that.
Tarantino in high school, and, you know, a lot of people continue to be into him in university. But then you've got those people who are like, well, no, everyone likes him, so clearly I'm not.
I got to do something else. Yeah.
I've got to do something that's more, you know, introspective,
Deep. Yeah, it's got to be deep.
and I think that you know, that always just winds up. I think you're at that point just kind of faking another side of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm curious, but it is interesting. I mean, not that we're going to solve the riddle or get to the heart of all of it here, but it is interesting that your experience is that younger film students, that this is that, and I could, you know, it makes sense in a sense. I mean, I could kind of see how, for sure, that, you know, Tarantino's films they're exciting, they're filled with action, and so they could be appealing to a wider audience and maybe a younger audience. It's a lot easier to watch this than, let's say, you know, if you're 7 years old, this is an easier film to watch than 2001, or especially like, you know, any, you know, Seven Samurai. I mean, God, I mean, how many films are, you know, it'd be difficult to digest, difficult to understand.
Yeah.
So for sure, I could see how his films are definitely more readily accessible, because I think he's taken, you know, so many pieces from genre films, exploitation films, action films, horror films, westerns. I mean, very popular genres, and combined them all into this big melting pot, you know, and kind of thrown his own personality and you know, voice into it. So for sure, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, you know, it's like, well, the thing I liked when I was 12, geez, I can't. I'm 22 and I'm at AFI. I can't make the thing that I loved when I was 12, because, boy, what does that say about me? I you know, so I think that sometimes happens. But I mean, so for me, I love all those genres. I love exploitation films. I love, you know, the spaghetti westerns and horror films, and, you know, now my kind of base of references is like a generation later than Tarantino's. So a lot of the stuff that he loves and a lot of stuff that he references isn't necessarily. Some of it is. But just the idea, though. I mean, I feel like, you know, he's kind of the front end of Gen X. I'm kind of the back end of Gen X. I think we're still in the same generation. There's not that many years apart. And I feel like we were kind of like, I was raised on television. I was raised on the radio. I was raised on VHS. I was raised on MTV. I was raised on pulp culture. I consumed just a ridiculous amount of it as a kid. And so I get a lot of that. You know,
Hmm.
I get a lot of what he's doing. It resonates with me. Does that part resonate with you at all, or is that different for your generation? Because we're both Gen X. He and I think we're both Gen X. I know I am. I think he is.
Yeah, he would be. Yeah.
And that part definitely resonates with me.
I think,
How in,
yeah, no, it definitely
does it?
resonates. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that the thing is that I always try to say to like students of mine who are really into Tarantino is, don't try and make a Tarantino movie. Look at the sources that Tarantino uses. Look at the stuff
Hmm.
that he loves, and if you want to make
Or
something
look
like
at
him,
something that you love even
yeah,
more.
or yeah,
Yeah.
vice versa, yeah, or look at something that you like. But like I think that that's the thing is it's you know, um, you're kind of when you when you Tarantino samples a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that the best way to analyze his work in a way is to like go back to the source of those samples.
Sure.
And so no, but I yeah, I totally agree that like a lot of a lot of what I would do again when I direct, obviously I like Hitchcock, I like Malick, I like Kubrick.
Yeah.
But I'm never sitting there asking myself, okay, like how would Malick or how would Kubrick direct this scene?
Right.
Or at least if I'm doing that, if I'm asking myself that question, it's more of an exercise.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Quentin's
And
doing that. Do you? I don't think. I think Quentin is like. Do you think Quentin is doing that?
no,
Do you
no, no,
think-
and but that's
Okay.
what I mean is that it's. But I think that that's the mistake that a lot
Yes,
of younger
yes.
people make.
Yeah, because I
Um,
think like because what I get a sense of, and this is what I think speaks to me, is that there's like an encoding, right? There's like
Yes, yeah.
there is a cultural encoding in the references that he's using. So it's like he is, you know, he is like adding to and using this this history of this this cultural encoding in all
Yeah.
of these references on purpose with great specificity, whether it's with his songs or whether it's with certain, you know, with the specific like explicit cultural references and dialogue, or with the kind of implicit way that he might stage a scene in a similar manner or use a similar type of shot, like for example,
or even just get a performance out of an actor.
or performance out of an actor.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be something as simple as like using the zooms in Django, and it's a direct callback to the way Sergio Leone would use zooms in his
Yeah.
films, and a lot of people wouldn't recognize that in any kind of conscious way, but on a subconscious level, he's kind of incorporating the cultural encoding and history. And bringing it into his films in a new context, so that resonates with me quite a bit. I think it's
Oh,
just
totally.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I make something is that I'll watch something that inspires me that I like a lot,
yeah,
and you take it in, you for lack of a better term, you consume the
Yeah.
material.
sure,
And then your brain sort of does something with it and breaks it down. It's kind of like
Mhm.
digests it
Well, it
and
becomes
breaks
a
it
part
down
of
into
you.
its fundamentals.
Especially, right? It becomes a part of you.
So then when I'm directing something or when I'm writing something or whatever, what I'm not doing is going, Kubrick shot that in a way, so I'm just going to take that shot. What I'm doing is like, okay, how did that shot make me feel
Mhm.
on a fundamental level, and how can I then use what I know to replicate that feeling, but in a way that I would do it? And I think that's what Tarantino does, is that he repurposes those things, he digests them, and then he goes, well, that, the way that these exploitation films used to make me feel was because they were really kinetic. But he's not using the kineticism literally from an exploitation film and
Right.
going like, well, he moved the camera, like there's that really sweet shot. Obviously there are some very specific shot references, but for the most part, it's, okay, the camera moves in this way that follows a character like this. How do I adapt that? How do I
Yeah.
digest that and understand this kineticism much more so like in a more broad sense than like a specific like, well, I'm going to set up this shot and light it to be exactly like it was in this
Yeah.
other movie.
I think a lot of it just happens. I mean, a lot of it is just that everything that you consume as an artist becomes part of you, and especially the things that you consume, I think, when you were younger, that become kind of a foundational part of your personality. It's like And different people are different. You know, it's like I feel very affected by the pop culture that I consumed, and I don't say pop culture in a derogatory sense, but television, film, and music that I consumed in my formative years had a huge impact on me. It informed a large part of who I am. And like I was talking to my wife about this. So my wife had an interesting situation. Boy, we're like digressing a little bit here, but what the heck? Why not? My wife grew up in a stricter family where she did not have access to at kind of those, 6 to 12, or 8 to 12, these like really pivotal years. She didn't have access to a lot of pop culture. She didn't watch television. She didn't really see cinema, and she didn't listen to a lot of popular current music. And it's very interesting, the difference that kind of, it's hard for her to kind of understand how important those things are to me because she doesn't have that same experience. And I don't, and so it's different from person to person. Not everybody has that same experience, but I think that's one of the things that I feel very connected to Quintin about is that I sense how important those things were to him in his childhood and how informative they were and formative. And I feel, different sources for me, but I get that. So it's interesting to see him kind of turn that into something else as an adult. It'll be interesting to see how he grows, if this next film that he makes, whatever that is actually his final film. It'll be interesting to see what he does next. If he writes or what he does. But there's something else I want to bring up because we're getting a little over an hour here. I want to talk to you just about a couple of things real quick. I'm curious, like when this film came out, I remember very specifically how people were discussing critics and just, the people on the street watching it were really blown away by the violence that they felt like this felt like they felt like it was just hyper violent, just over the top violent, like, oh my gosh, which I don't know that I thought about too much then, but thinking about it later, I'm really surprised about. I'm surprised about
way less violent than I remember.
Well, and I'm curious. I want to add, because it's like there were a lot of films now because the 80s was all about mega violence, right? I mean, Rambo, especially like Rambo,
Die Hard,
the second one and the third one, Die Hard. You've got all the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, like Commando,
all much more violent than this.
And I mean, where there's like literally hundreds of people being killed, like literally hundreds of people are being killed, just blown away, right? Just machine gunned down. What do you think? So, why do you think people saw this film and thought, "Wow, this is insane violence"?
I think it's I think it's casual in this movie. It's more casual than it is in like an action film where.
And tell me more about what you mean by that. Like when you say it's casual,
so it's
elaborate on that.
It's presented in I'm gonna sneeze again. You can't get those violent sneezes out of my head. So we're gonna be. I think that it's casual in a sense that it's presented not necessarily as violence was before. It's not big and grand and blockbustery. It's quite, there's the joke, Marvin's head being blown off is like, it's very like, oh man, it's like dealt with in a way that's sort of more comedic. I also think that,
but don't you? I feel like that would undercut. It's interesting because I feel like there is almost.
I think it's just because it's different. I think more so people didn't know how to react to it.
Because
I think the other thing too is that it's violent in a way that people like. I think one of the reasons people might assume this is violent is because the way people talk to each other in the movie is violence quote unquote. There's a lot of like just yelling at each other and like telling someone to shut up and stuff like that.
Be cool, honey bunny.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think that perhaps that's it. Like the scene opens on them, when they run out and rob the thing, and she's like, "I'll blast every one of you," and it's like you get that kind of thing, which I think was,
which
just
is one
different.
of the best
and I think
line
that
deliveries.
And I just think that people didn't really know what to think, and so I
you
think
it's the novelty of how it was presented. You feel like heightened it in people's minds. Yeah. You're on I agree with you in the same kind of vein. I think, it's interesting. Quentin Tarantino undercuts almost every if not every scene of violence with humor. I mean, I don't think people talk often about how humorous the film is, but almost every scene, if not every scene, is totally undercut or has either undercut by humor or it has humor around it, and really funny humor. Yes, and you would think that would de-emphasize or disarm some of the violence, but it didn't. But I mean, whether it's like Mia Wallace getting the adrenaline shot right in the heart, I remember everybody just going on and on about that when this movie first came out. And you have like this totally hysterical button at the end of that scene where, you know, the woman with all the piercings is like groovy, man.
Yeah, that was trippy.
Yeah, or trippy, man. Yeah, and so every scene is like that. You know, it's like you've got Sam Jackson with Tim Roth. You know, at the end with Tim Roth's got his gun in his face, and he's like taking Sam's wallet, and Sam's like, I need my wallet back, and he's like, well, which one is it? And he's like, it's the one that says bad, you know. I won't say it here because we'll get an explicit, but he's, you know, and that's freaking hysterical, dude. Like, who has a wallet that says bad MFer on it, you know? It's hysterical, you know. Every single scene of violence is like that. Like, you talk about Marvin's head getting blown off, it's freaking funny.
Yeah.
To me, it's hysterical. When I watch this movie, I laugh my butt off. When I saw this movie,
I think that's kind of what
I laugh my butt off. And so I guess maybe this is another way that I feel a kinship to Quentin Tarantino, because, you know, I've never equated cinema violence to real world violence ever. I don't I do not equate those two things. As a matter of fact, I think that art is a healthy outlet for things like violence, for us to explore them, and actually could potentially even lower the amount of real world violence that could exist if you have a healthy outlet for those kinds of things. But not to get too deep in that, but I found it funny. Like, to me, the violence is a setup for humor. So I never quite understood, like, and Kill Bill came out, you know, and it was like she's, you know, kills whatever 50 people in that scene. To me, it seemed so humorous, you know.
Well, I mean, there's that famous interview where he's on, like, I don't know what, some like cable news network, and the lady's interviewing about him, and she's like, it's grotesque. There's so much blood and violence.
Yeah,
you know, why do you do that? Why do you have to make it so violent? And then he's like, because it's so much fun, Jan.
And I agree. And I it's weird. I think it's weird. And we're not going to be able to break it down here. We'll have to wrap up soon. But I think there's something. This is an interesting thing where it's like Rambo can blow away 100. Like Vietnam, whatever it was in Rambo 2. God, I don't remember. You know, it's like Vietnamese, like just nameless, faceless third world people, right, in the story. And nobody cares. But somehow Quentin does it where, like, you know, a violent criminal is murdered in a bathroom, and it's, you know, and it's like Pop-Tarts, you know, it's even that has a funny button.
Yeah.
And people freak out over John Travolta getting shot, but it's like you can murder 100 nameless, faceless, third world country, you know, people. Like, it's just, I don't know. We're not going to suss that out here, but there's something weird going on there. But I feel like Quentin Tarantino's film uses violence in kind of the same way that Bugs Bunny uses violence.
Yeah, it's like it's vaudevillian.
It's not. Yeah, I never get the sense that this is, like, real, even though it's intimate. The violence is usually intimate. Now, not always, but anyway, it's just interesting. I mean, but it's something you felt as a young kid, though. You said the violence it stood out to you, but you were 7, so I could see that for sure.
I think it was more so than the violence, though. I think it was just the tone. Yeah. It was much more of the tone than it was the violence itself.
This kind of happenstance that you just felt like, it's like, oh, well, yeah, okay, this is just violence. This is the world we live in. Now clean off the brains.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, it's just my everyday life in my Canadian suburb.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the delivery and context was just hysterical. But
yeah, and I guess one thing I do want to touch on quickly too is the cinematography.
Oh yeah.
On Andrzej Sakula, I don't know, I might be mispronouncing that name completely, but
that's
so this
the best
was
shot. Yeah,
his last film that he did with Tarantino
Right.
before Tarantino went on to work
And
with.
he did shoot Reservoir Dogs, by the way. So
Yeah.
he did shoot these 2 films with Quentin, right?
And I'm someone who I really like Robert Richardson. I think Robert Richardson does like JFK. I think it looks fantastic.
Yeah.
But I actually have got to say that this might be my favorite looking of all of Tarantino's. Like in terms
Tell
of
me
the
more
look,
about that. Yeah, what do you
I
what
think
do you
that
think?
it's it feels super lo-fi, and I kind
Yeah,
of like that.
yes.
You know, it almost feels like when Sam Jackson and John Travolta are walking up to the house right at the beginning, like they're walking through to the apartment complex.
Hmm.
It feels kind of like Miami Vice, like it's like this weird kind of like lo-fi 80s
Well,
cool.
it's kind of
almost.
flat. It's kind of beige.
Yeah, that's not like super saturated. It's and the light is also really really stark when they're
Yeah.
talking in that you know, the Tim Roth scene right at the beginning.
Yeah.
The light on half of their face is like completely blown out, and
Yeah.
it's stark, and it's like really kind of high contrast, but
You
and
can
really
see
rich.
it's natural
really
light.
rich.
You can see
Yeah.
there's I mean it's natural light, but it also it speaks to the budget of the film, I think, to a great extent. You know, you're always in interiors. There's almost never anything any kind of scope. We're in a car. And
Yeah.
it's fun how Quentin uses rear projection or process
Yes,
shots, very obvious process shots in the cars. But everything is very lo-fi, low budget, which I think stands out more to me now than it ever did before.
Yeah, and I just really liked. I think the movie
Yeah.
just looks really really. I like when cinematographers don't have a lot to work with. I think it makes them a little bit brilliant in a way. Whereas,
Well, it works great for the film, right? I mean, it works
yeah, I
great
find
for
it
the
when
subject
someone
matter.
has like 100 lights that they can set up anywhere. It kind of bores me a little bit, honestly, because it's like you can do anything with it.
Yeah.
And I do not. Do we want to get really really briefly, perhaps, just to finish off on the Deakins Tarantino kind of little mini debate they
Yeah,
had about.
we can talk about that. I do want to briefly touch on just music and cast real fast. I mean, we're already long, but I feel remiss if we didn't touch on those, and then let's go to that. I mean, obviously, a lot was made about bringing John Travolta back in the cast.
Yeah, he was really in a slump there.
It was a brilliant casting. I mean, it was a brilliant move. I don't know if this was like, a conscious choice, but I mean, apparently Quentin really stuck to his guns. He was like, look, at this point he's talking to Miramax. He's like, if Travolta can't be in the lead, then you're not the person to make this film. So a pretty bold move, but it was, it ended up being great for the story, and it ended up being really fantastic for the marketing of the film, because imagine all the like logistic ways that this is great. I mean, he gets an actor, although in a current slump, brings with him a huge audience, right? Brings with him a huge recognition, but you don't have to pay him a lot. I mean, it was a really brilliant piece of casting, and it was a really fantastic fit. But of course, Sam Jackson is in almost all of Quentin's movies. Yeah. Sam Jackson is just amazing. He's a really standout performance, but it's just so many of these performances are fantastic. I mean, you talked about in the beginning, Amanda Plummer with Tim Roth.
Yeah.
I mean, Ving Rhames, Eric Stoltz, even these smaller roles like Rosanna Arquette, Christopher Walken. And, apparently Bruce Willis was, worked for scale on this to be in the scene that is your least favorite. But hey, I mean, to get Bruce Willis at this era in your film, combination of amazing marketing and now you'd be hard pressed to imagine any of these people in, a different actor in any of these roles. It's just, he gets Harvey Keitel back. Of course, Harvey Keitel.
That's one of my favorite. I love Harvey Keitel.
And he was instrumental, of course, in getting Reservoir Dogs made, right? He was attached and was helped lock down financing from the get-go. Uma Thurman, and then, of course, goes on to do Kill Bill 1 and 2 with her.
Yep.
It's just, and Quentin clearly gets great performances over and over.
Yeah, they all, like, you can really feel that, and both you and I have acting experience. you just know when someone is just like playing up and like having so much fun.
Yeah, you can sense
and
the joy.
and there's nothing better than when you are acting and someone just like a director just allows you to just go far with something and just is like, hey, give me like the most ridiculous, most ridiculously high energy take you can, and then you kind of bring that back, but you still retain that just kind of like feeling of like passion and energy for the moment, and you can really that kind of oozes off the screen in this.
Things I've heard, obviously I've never worked with Quintin, would love to, but things I've heard, a couple things I think really lends itself to great performances. One, Quintin, his encyclopedic knowledge of film is integral on the front end to casting. I think he has a good intuition about casting people, but I think also his enthusiasm and passion for cinema in general on set seems to be really contagious. I mean, a lot of people talk about how Quintin's sets are really, they feel like family, that it's some of the most fun sets that people have ever worked on, whether it's crew or cast. You get a lot of feedback from people who've worked with Quintin that he loves doing what he's doing so much. And he happens to be in a position where he's got quite a bit of free reign to do exactly what he wants.
People really want to work with him.
There's not a lot of friction there, right? So the people who are on his sets want to be there. He wants them there. And it sounds to me, from what I've heard just peripherally, that they're just fantastic, fantastic sets. Mm-hmm. That's got to contribute, pretty substantially to these consistently amazing performances, for sure. And then last thing I just want to touch base on, it's because you could do a whole podcast about each one of these things, but music, there isn't any original score for the film, of course. It's been talked about a million times over that Quintin does the same thing with music as he does with his cinema references, and you listen to it and it's really extraordinarily effective. It's like, what more could be said? It's like people have talked about it forever, but I was even surprised, when I popped this in and I watched it again for this, just in the beginning, how the music just hits you over the head, how we've got that, the Dick Dale surfer music stuff comes on.
Then the Black Eyed Peas.
And then, it's, not Black Eyed Peas, it's Jungle Boogie comes on like right after that, but it's just, hits you with this.
But I just mean that the Black Eyed Peas sampled the Dick Dale. Stuff for that.
Song, boy, I'm not a huge fan of Black Eyed Peas. Me neither. But I mean, it's just this 1-2 punch of like auditory, just energy that just and it's like, wow, this is going to be epic, and this is going to be loud, and it's energetic, and it's amazing usage of music to kind of set you up for 15 minutes of the next 15 minutes are just talking. But really continuing what he did with Reservoir Dogs into Pulp Fiction, and he's done pretty much every film since. Okay, so let's jump into this thing that you wanted to talk about.
Just really wrap like up. Last kind of point. So there was this spat recently. They call it a spat.
Was it really?
Basically, yeah, it was like they were responding kind of to each other.
Were they?
So as some people listening may or may not know, Roger Deakins, cinematographer, won the Oscar twice pretty recently. He is, I would say, probably the most popular cinematographer working. Like everyone I talk to,
Deakins is
that's also a DP. They all love D. I'm kind of indifferent. No offense to Deakins, I think he's a great cinematographer, but not my style.
Yeah.
But he was talking about how much he doesn't like shooting on film, and how he gets he just doesn't like the work that is required to kind of like see your image. That like with digital you can see the dailies. Deakins also, this is something that, but this is context, but not something that came up in the debate. But Deakins also is someone who famously has said he doesn't do much with the digital negative. That he likes to do what he does on set with lights and doesn't really touch. Obviously there's color correction going on, but doesn't really like to do much with like the digital negative, and by way of like, adding things or changing things with the actual negative. Tarantino, obviously, on the other hand, famous for saying that like the only way to shoot a movie is on film, and that like cinema is 24 frames a second celluloid running through a camera and being projected on film and all that. And of course, he has the new Beverly in Los Angeles. You know, I think both of us, I land somewhere sort of in the middle. Whereas I think that obviously the advent of digital was incredibly liberating for you know,
I like
liberating
that.
for cinema and for
Yeah.
making people, like, I wouldn't have been able to shoot my movie on film. But what I did was that I, you know, on the opposite end of someone like Deakins and much more in the style of a cinematographer who I really like, Steve Yedlin, you know, I think that it's a waste of time to not do anything with your negative. I think that to not take advantage of every tool you have and to go into post and go, okay, I'm going to craft the look of this. I crafted the look of my feature before I even made it. I did extensive camera tests and got, you know, the color and the light and the halation and all this stuff exactly the way I wanted it, so that when we were shooting, I saw in this, you know, the image exactly what it was. And I think it's partially, again, this is a very controversial opinion, but I think that's partially the reason that Deakins doesn't really stick out to me as someone that I go to for inspiration a lot. I find that his images just kind of lack texture, and that he doesn't do a lot with them. Whereas he's he's great at lighting and stuff like that. But then Tarantino responded and basically called Deakins lazy and said, like, you know, he doesn't like to shoot on film because he just doesn't like to wait and it's more work and blah blah blah. And so, like, yeah, I think that, you know, I like the look of celluloid images. I like the look of film. Do I think that that's something at this point that you necessarily, you know, that an audience can pick out whether something is like really well emulated digital photography that has been, you know, used to emulate film versus real film? I don't think that a you know, casual audience is going to notice the difference. However, I will say that I do. The visual aesthetics of film that are lost on digital are something that Deakins doesn't really make an effort to gain back, which I think are, I think they're just things, you know, opinion based that look good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could, you know, I think, look, I can't speak for Quentin Tarantino. We know that where he stands on film, and I think that's fine. I mean, it's. I think for Quentin Tarantino, this is a very personal thing, and it's like if you're a painter, you're gonna have a certain paintbrush type that you're gonna gravitate toward. You know, it for him, it's and I get it, right? This is like the most personal thing he does is make movies, and the tools that he uses to do that are necessarily, they're going to be personal, and I love that. Look, if it didn't matter to him, I would be really questioning that. I'd be like, it doesn't matter to you, like you don't care what your canvas is. So I think that's wonderful. And then it's also totally fine if somebody else wants to, you know, thinks digital is the best thing since sliced bread. More power to you. Go for it. There's room for both. I personally like the look of film better. But I realize that that's likely because that's what I grew up seeing. Okay. This isn't a logical thing. This is like art is often not logical. This is a personal, subjective thing. I like the look of film better. But for me personally, it's not practical to shoot on film. I'm going to shoot digitally, of course, because it's more important for me to make a film on anything than it is for me to like only make a picture on film like that. Of course, I'm going to use,
that's
you know,
the important part, right?
Like, who cares?
It's subjective. When I say that I find that Deacon's image lacks texture, that's something that a lot of people like.
Yeah, subjective.
You know, a lot of people like that ultra crisp, you know, smooth digital look, and that's totally fine. I'm not saying that, you know, Deakins is I would never ever say that Deakins is a bad cinematographer, because I don't believe that. But to me, I like an image with texture. I like an image that, you know, and so if I'm shooting digitally, I will add that texture.
Yeah,
I'll add a little bit of gate weave, because I find that I like the organic look where it feels like you can just feel. It's hard to describe, but there's just like a subconscious feeling where you can just, there's an element to which it's so textured and visceral and organic and lifelike that, you know, if I'm going to shoot something, and I've also shot things that I don't use film emulation on. I've done short films that I've been like, I don't want that. And I've DP'd things that it just doesn't fit. Depends on obviously the subject matter. And so I think that's kind of why I say I land somewhere in the middle.
If I had my druthers, if I had my druthers, I would shoot with film for sure.
Yes.
But the bigger reason than how it looks is, I think, what the workflow is.
Yep,
And I
that
think
too, yeah.
Quentin is speaking to some of this, which is that, I look again, I'm guessing, we're guessing here. But my guess is that Quentin Tarantino likes the workflow of film because it's a slower moving set.
It instills a discipline.
It does that too. But you're spending half a day, maybe, or hours to light a scene. So there's a lot of attention paid. You have to be more specific with your lighting with film.
Yeah,
And then, of course, when you're shooting film, now I don't know if, look, Quentin could shoot all the film in the world that he wanted to. So, but I think it still does affect people. They know that money is running through the camera. They know that, it's. And this means something. So there's like a certain amount of focus.
If you've ever been on a set or shot with film or anything like that, or heard a film camera roll, it's a distinct noise to digital.
It's different.
Digital, you could be rolling, you wouldn't know, but when you're shooting something on film, you can hear it. You can, and film cameras are designed to be as quiet as possible, but you can still, there is this hum, and you can feel the film moving through the gate, and okay, we're rolling.
Yeah.
We are literally rolling.
Yeah.
From where the word comes from. So
there's a history there that you're kind of calling back to. It makes perfect sense that Tarantino, who was inspired by film so much, would only want to shoot on film. It makes perfect sense. If you grew up listening to records, to vinyl records, you may have an affinity for vinyl records over things that technically sound better, right? But it's not about that. It's about a subjective tactile. So I get it,
and there are also movies that I've seen that are crisp and digital that I really like the looks of as well. But I thought Parasite looked really good, and that's a very digital looking movie.
Yeah. So I think it's, so I'm happy that it all exists. I'm happy there are people out there like Quentin Tarantino who kind of keep film alive. And I'm really happy for that. But yeah, I'm not dogmatic about anything.
No.
But yeah, well, oh my gosh. You know what? Hey, this may be, I'm not quite sure, but this may be the longest episode we have ever done.
I think it is our longest. Yeah. I don't think
at
we've
an
done
hour and a half. Wow. And I think we also broke the record for most sneezes.
Yep. Sorry about that.
I'm debating, should I leave them in? Well, we'll find out. But all right.
It should be easy to find in the...
it should be easy to find. It'll be the big spikes. Well, anyway, we could go on and on, but we should probably draw this to a close now. There's so many things we could talk about, but I've really enjoyed it, Cullen, and it's interesting to hear, some of your views, being 20 years removed from me, and kind of what your impression of this film is and your experience with it. That's really fun for me. Sometimes it's kind of like getting to see it through somebody else's eyes, which is quite fun. But yeah, I've had a blast. I enjoyed it. I look forward to what your pick is going to be for next time around. So exciting. All right. Well, everybody, we hope you enjoyed it too. And hopefully you've made it this far. Boy, if you have, you're a trooper. But hey, until next time, everybody, have a wonderful couple weeks, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.